We have a great lineup here today to have a conversation about the how does our midterm election taking place next Tuesday might impact the rest of the Trump administration's foreign policy, and how that might impact Indo-Pacific, and how this is all looking from the region. And I can't think of anyone but these three gentlemen to tell us this view today. Immediately to my left is Mr. Dan Twining. He's the president and CEO of the International Republican Institute. Prior to his position, he worked for a long time at the German Marshall Fund, looking over their Asia portfolio, and recently joined IRI. Next to him is Ambassador Derek Mitchell. In full disclosure, he's my former boss at CSIS.
Watch it.
But since then, clearly he has now moved on and do a lot more greater things than I have been doing in think tanking. Since he was at CSIS, then he moved on to Pentagon during the Obama administration, worked as a principal deputy assistant secretary of defense for Asia Pacific, and then he was, he became the ambassador to Myanmar. First ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Myanmar after the two countries normalized their relationship. And I'm very privileged to have you here.
Good to see you.
And he's currently at the president and CEO of the National Democratic Institute. To his left is my collaborator, Mr. Kuni Miyake, research director of the Kennan Institute of Global Studies in Tokyo. He's a retired diplomat. He's a Middle Eastern specialist by training, but he has worked on the alliance issues for a long time, but then he also has looked at the Japan-China relationship also for a long time as well. So he's perfectly situated to tell us more about Pan-Asia view on this. And as we were chatting, kind of talking about how this conversation is going to flow, he already told us that he is going to speak as if he were Yoda, living in the somewhere deep into somewhere in the Eurasian continent in the desert. So with that, that's what he was saying. So with that, this is how the conversation is going to flow. I'm going to throw out one question to each of the three panelists here, and then after hearing their thought out, I think I would just immediately open this up to the floor to get your questions. So with that, Dan, election day is coming up next Tuesday. Tell us your prediction of the election results, and if you think of any foreign policy issue that might get impacted, depending on how the election will come out. I'd love to hear that.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Yuki. I'm delighted to be here with old friends on this stage. I don't work for the Trump administration. In fact, I have 6 senators and 1 congresswoman who may become the next top Republican of the House Appropriations Committee on my board. So I actually work for Congress rather than the administration. So
important distinction, though.
Just flagging that. Okay, so I think Republicans make gains in the Senate and Democrats make big gains in the House. That's my safe prediction, although we can talk about it. What does it mean for American foreign policy? So actually, it's quite interesting. Congress is quite traditional in foreign policy. The Trump administration proposed cutting State Department funding, development accounts. Congress, led by Republicans, pushed back on that over the last 2 years. The Trump administration sent 2 budgets to the Hill that had as deep as 40% cuts to the civilian side of American power and influence in the world, and Congress did not accept those. In fact, in some cases, they plussed up from previous years. So that's point 1. Is that I think Congress is in a much more traditional place, whether it's led by Republicans or Democrats or both in the scenario we may be looking at. Point 2 is, in fact, Congress has done some legislating on foreign policy that's been very bipartisan in the last 2 years. Russia sanctions, North Korea sanctions. There was a Russia, Iran, North Korea sanctions bill that passed the Senate recently by 98 votes to 2 and passed the House by 419 votes to 3. So I don't see any partisan issue there. The BUILD Act, this new development finance agency that will sort of embrace OPIC but be bigger, that the administration and Congress sees as modernizing some of the ways we do development finance, including to compete with China and other powers who are doing their own forms of development of finance. that was a clear bipartisan success in Congress. That was a big bipartisan success, I think, for soft power projected from America in the world. There were votes, I'm going to go out of area for a minute, but right before the famous Helsinki summit, the US Senate voted 98-2 in favor of a strong and expansive NATO, right? The reaction on Capitol Hill to the killing of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi has been intensely bipartisan, I would argue, with actually many Republicans way out front criticizing the administration for its approach. So to conclude, I'm not sure how much will actually change if you actually look at the record of bipartisanship. There are some big things we should maybe talk about down the road, including defense spending, which is looking out at a 5% cut in 2020. And last time we were here, I talked about America building up hard power in Asia after defense spending was cut by 25%. 25% during the Obama administration, which Congress was also culpable for. But if we're looking again at defense cuts, I think that's something that Congress will want to engage on.
Great, Dan. Derek, give us your side of the view.
First of all, let me also say how proud I am to be with my old friends here on the podium. And Yuki, there's a saying about how the student becomes the master. I can't say that Yuki was ever my student. She always was teaching me about Japan, even when she worked for me. So I continue to learn from you, and thank you for inviting me to Stimson today. I'm not going to get into predictions. You know why? Because I'm a Democrat. We get in trouble when we make predictions. And I just, you know, whatever pollsters say, whatever anybody says, we'll see what happens on Tuesday. But a few things, just sort of some themes, and builds, I think, off of what Dan said. First of all, I think he is true that looking back, if you actually look at the record of Congress in the past few years, there have actually been some remarkably bipartisan things that were done. I mean, the budget was actually passed. I haven't seen that in a long time. On the issue of funding for democracy work, for State Department, for otherwise, that was a bipartisan thing, as Dan suggested. But I think the day after the election, we have to recognize a few dynamics that are changing. The day after Tuesday is the first day of a new campaign. It's the first day of the 2020 election campaign. So you're going to have some different dynamics there as well. You will have some Democrats decide that they have to, certainly those who are running for president will be trying to stake their claim, their difference with the administration. There may be some of them are in Congress, and they may themselves decide they have to stake a different position. Also, the makeup of Congress will change. Those in the Democratic Party who look like they're going to win, or at least the makeup generally of those Democratic candidates, whether they have the majority or not, at least let's say they do get a majority, which most people think they will. They include many veterans, many women with experience, and many people, both veterans and women, who have experience in foreign policy in previous administrations. So you can't generalize about how it's going to go depending on party. You may find bipartisan support for many issues of engagement in the world, a commitment to alliances, which a majority of Americans believe in, a commitment to international trade, though Democrats, if there's a blue wave, that can go both ways. Democratic base is is much more aligned towards the Trump view of trade. You know, there are a lot of things that can play into this. You also see on the Senate side, which is likely to stay Republican, sort of thinking about how that would align. You have the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will change. So you don't have Corker, who was very much, well, you see him be much more assertive in pushing back against the Trump administration. And Senator Risch, who has a record of maybe aligning much more closely to Trump. So less maybe of oversight from the Hill, even from Republicans. So it's very difficult. I think the bottom line is it's very difficult to predict not only what will happen, but even how this is going to play out, because there are a lot of cross currents, both of bipartisan support for individual issues, the fact that foreign policy is not going to be central to the election. We're going to be focused very much internally the day after the election. Whether it's the election or if Democrats get the House, then on investigations and such. We'll be distracted. That may have an impact broadly on foreign policy. It's very difficult to predict, but requires, I think, engagement by those of us who believe in an internationalist frame.
Thank you, both. So, Kuni, So it looks like it's very muddy waters, even
Right.
if you're in the country. So how does
If
that
the
all
Americans
looking
cannot
outside the
predict, how
country?
can I predict?
I'm not
but
asking for prediction from you.
So there are certain things, I think. First of all, if the prediction goes that way, the Democrats are going to get the Congress, House of Representatives, then probably the U.S. American domestic political power struggle would intensify because the Democrats are going to control those committees, probably. So that means you can imagine how many hearings, subpoenas, debates, and scandals that would put could put the American domestic politics in turmoil. So if I were Mr. Trump, I'm not, I hope, I would be in trouble. Then he tends to try to divert attention, always. Then do something, I wouldn't say crazy, but that's something unusual. That's always happened. It has been happening, and it will probably continue to happen. So that would put the allies of the United States in the world in possible trouble. Today, as I told you, I never wanted to talk about Japan, my country, because I tried to pretend to be a hermit, wise man, sort of somewhere in Asia, somewhere between the Middle East and East Asia. So my sort of reflection, because I'm 165 years old. I was born in 1853. Looking back, especially since year 2001, the United States is drifting. And we destroyed Iraq. And we didn't help the right people in Syria. And the overdose and underdose really created chaos in the Middle East. I was in one of the Middle East think tanks yesterday, and I was shocked. The Iranians are taking over Iraq, literally. And they are talking about the need for American assistance, American resources to the Middle East again. And fine, but what about the discussion, remember, about rebalancing? Remember, just a few years ago, maybe, or a long time ago. I don't remember when. But at that time, the Middle East hands were worried. Okay, maybe the American attention would divert from the Middle East to Asia. So what's going to happen to us? That's the worry of the Middle Easterners in Washington, D.C., to the best of my knowledge. So when I was there, and I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen to the American international attention? You know, since 2001, I wouldn't say excessive, but a lot of resources have been brought into the Middle East. And you fought wars over there. And I wouldn't say you wasted the energy, but it was costly war, to be honest. Then, still, you are there. And you cannot leave. If I were the president of the United States, I cannot leave. And from the Asian point of view, I don't want the Americans to leave the Middle East either. So you have to stay there. But the situation over there will not improve, I don't think, at least in the foreseeable future. That means you have to stay there. And while you were watching and focusing on the Middle East, China rose. And China will continue to rise as long as you spend more time and energy in the Middle East. So my question yesterday was, what kind of balance in terms of the U.S. attention internationally between the Middle East and East Asia? Those are both important parts of the world. And for countries in Asia, it is extremely important because the Asian nations are dependent on the Middle Eastern oil. and gas. While we need U.S. presence in East Asia. So how could you sort of solve the issue of balance of attention of the U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you. I think before opening up to the audience, I wonder if you have a quick response to the issue that Kuni raised towards very end.
I mean, I think what Kuni raises is a challenging set of issues in the best of times. I mean, if we were united as a country, if we were thinking, you know, in common purpose as a country, it's tough to figure out how do you balance resources, how do you balance attention. These days, where as I mentioned, after the election, I think there's going to be, even if there's some unity on some issues on the Hill, it's a divisive moment because elections start in 2020. That division, that lack of unity, that lack of strategic focus, that lack of ability to think strategically, the focus inward, the distraction inward, all of that makes that much, much harder. And it's much, not just harder to address, but much harder for our partners and our allies to have to manage and think about and deal with. So you start seeing, I mean, you start seeing a little bit, I mean, Abe is with the United States, no doubt about it, Japan's with us, but hedging a little bit because of uncertainty about the trajectory of the United States, a little bit of hedging of, well, maybe we ought to make sure our relations with other neighbors are secure because we're not exactly sure how secure our relations will be going forward with the U.S., so we can't count on the U.S. the way we have in the past. Again, I don't think there are decisions being made or realignments being pursued. But I do think it's a tough period, I would think, for the next 2 years. I hope it doesn't turn out that way. I hope that politics and foreign policy stops at the water's edge. But I fear that in the environment we're in, that may not be the case, at least for 2 more years or longer.
Dan, your thought?
So I think there's a recurring phenomenon in America that we are very privileged and blessed by our geography, by our resource endowments, by our situation. And that wouldn't it be nice just to be energy independent and not to go fight wars in the Middle East and not to worry too much about Chinese revanchism or Russian revanchism or other dangers? And you know, most Americans are not thinking about these issues, right? And politicians in our country have always faced a struggle to explain the stakes. And I'm not sure politicians of either party for some time now have done the best job of really explaining the stakes, particularly at this moment where I accept the proposition that the return of great power competition is real. That we are looking at a set of stresses on the international order that America and our allies built after 1945 and then enlarged after '89. We're facing an unprecedented set of stresses to that system. And you know, I think too many people in America aren't really thinking about this inheritance and the need to protect and preserve it amidst domestic debate and amidst the fact that actually the economy is doing very well. We're at full employment, right? We do have this energy abundance. There are lots of things. There's lots of good news out there if you are an American. But how do we then tie that to our global role and posture, right? And I think this has been a conversation that's recurrent throughout American history. Whether you read about the 20s or the 30s or the 40s or the immediate post-Cold War period when we had these quite existential debates about things like leaving Europe, pulling back from Asia. And these are issues that are going to stay with us, but I do think it's possible to rally people to a form of leadership around opportunities, but also around the fact that this world that we built is under pressure.
Like I say, there's one issue, it's funny, that I think we do unify on, and, which is China in a way. China has, for both parties, for different reasons, and maybe have difference of opinion on how to deal with China, but China kind of offers something for everybody in negative terms. You know, when it comes to trade issues or security issues or human rights issues or jobs, I mean, they are able to unite Americans in a way of concern about China's impact here at home or overseas, where people are really concerned about what this means for the United States, for their pocketbooks as well as for their position in the world or for the norms and standards and values that we stand up for with our allies. The question, of course, is how to deal with China and how to do it in a way that's not excessive, that doesn't reach a hysterical proportion, that is balanced and that is as much about a positive vision as it is a negative vision, being against something, but really being for something. And how do we get allies around it? But again, I don't think we're in a position now to have that conversation in the way we need to, which is really unfortunate.
It's an irony that China is becoming a unifying factor for the bipartisan sort of a discussion in Washington, D.C. in terms of foreign policy. But my question then, just looking back, China's rise is inevitable. You know, the 1840, they lost the war to the United Kingdom, they lost Hong Kong, and then all the historical nightmare started. Then now finally they are ready to come back, ready to overcome that trauma, historical trauma. So the question is, yes, we are united so far, and interestingly, even Mr. President, the president joined us. So that makes the U.S. policy vis-a-vis China is very consistent. Made it very consistent. Having said that, what's going to be the end game? What do we want from China in the long run? You see, it's easy to pressure China, but that could make China overreact to the pressure, and we have a problem in the Middle East. But what do we want from China? I mean, you just want to reduce the deficit, or no? I don't think so. You want more than that, and we want more than that. So then, what's the end result? What do we want? Do you want to destroy the Communist Party leadership, or do you just want to change their policy to what extent? 100% or 50%? What do you want from China at the end of the game? That's my question.
Any quick question? Yeah.
Well, there are two parts of that. One is what we would like with China, and there's a question of dealing with China as it is and as it might be. As you say, they're a major power, and they're going to be what they are. Potentially, could try to shape, but we do have to engage to try to shape in certain ways. But we have to do both at the same time: deal with China as it is, as well as work with it to create a relationship that we would like to see. I think the thing that we're looking for from China, the thing that really divides us the most, is on the issue that I just mentioned of norms, of standards, of rules, of values to some degree. But I would stay away from values. But it's really about norms, standards, rules, laws. But what are the rules of the international system going to look like in the 21st century? By what standards are we going to apply ourselves, whether it's in foreign aid or in our foreign contracts or in maritime affairs, in non-proliferation, in transparency? Those are the types of things I think we are looking to work with China to understand better what are their goals, and to try to shape, hopefully, or work with China and encourage them to integrate themselves into a system that works for all, that doesn't just work for themselves, that is not just self-involved, but is helpful to a broader stability and security for the world. And yes, what we work on is democracy and affirming the human dignity around the world. And I think, yes, that's definitely part of what we would like to see as well. We want to work on both inside China as well as outside, and that everything they do that should affirm those values. But it's not an anti-China kind of thing. We're integrated with China economically. It's not. I don't think it's about trying to dissociate ourselves or disintegrate our relationship entirely. I think it's not very constructive for us. But it is being thoughtful about the right balance in our relationship going forward.
Balance. So our Asian allies always get very anxious when we get too close to China, and they also get too anxious when the relationship turns too hot and conflictual, right? So how do you find a balance? And what does that mean? I mean, certainly in our space, in the democracy space, I mean, we would like a China that doesn't come in and corrupt and subvert democracies and open societies. We have seen quite a bit of that in places like Cambodia. So I think going to Derek's point, Kuni, you shouldn't be surprised. I mean, the American public, I think Trump may be more the vehicle for a set of sentiments in the United States around China than the great evangelist, right? That he actually may not be your preferred messenger, but that there has been tension building in this US-China relationship for a long time around the way China behaves externally. And I think we are overdue for a course correction, right? And whether that frame is great power competition, or it's taking on predatory and mercantilistic economics, or it's deploying authoritarian influence to subvert democratic norms in third countries, we are ripe for a national conversation and a conversation with our allies about how to stand up to these things. We are overdue for that. So frankly, I welcome it.
With that, I think I'll open up the floor. So I think there will be a microphone, so if you can wait until the microphone gets to you and tell us who you are. And only one rule that I would ask everyone to obey is that do not make your questions longer than your remarks. Well, actually, that's the way around. Don't make speeches. Please ask questions. We have a limited time, and I would like to entertain as many as possible. So with that, let's go to the far left. Left
It's not a
of my
political
side.
comment.
Hello, my name is Harjop. Thanks again for your perspective. It's actually really unique. I just want to touch upon, as we were just talking about China, like looking at, say, India in particular. The Trump administration has been trying to engage India, but recently, India, based on its traditional foreign policy, has been acting upon its, independent sovereign right? So there's been news that they're going to be purchasing advanced weaponry from Russia, and so the U.S. government is not very happy about that. So I'm just curious with the midterm elections, whether it be China or India, because there is definitely a great power dynamic happening right now in the Asia-Pacific. Do you see any changes in the way we approach, the way we do coalition building, or maybe do we, or are there any particular issues beyond trade, such as human rights, which is starting to become an increasingly, big concern not only in China but in India? Will there be any changes in that front?
So we're actually, I'm going to set aside trade for a second and then come back to it, because on trade we're not aligned. And I think that's partly our fault and partly India's fault in the current incarnation. But we're very aligned with India, and this relationship has taken big steps even just in the last few years with a set of defense agreements and other engagements. I mean, this is a relationship that successive administrations in New Delhi, starting in 1998, and successive administrations in the United States, sounding in the same year, have embraced and driven forward. So this is one of the bilateral relationships, actually, I'm personally most optimistic about in the scheme of things. Our interests are very aligned in South Asia, including lately in the Maldives and Sri Lanka, given political turmoil in those countries. Our interests are very aligned in Africa and other developing countries where I think we collectively do not want these countries to embrace a Chinese surveillance state, statist model, if you will, rather a more open model. So there are lots of synergies. I think the trade thing is a complication. India's having its own set of economic problems at the moment. Our economy is almost too hot, and so the value of the rupee has plummeted, as you know. But this is a relationship that I think we can be bullish about long term. I will say, though, going to Derek's point about hedging, that the Indians do feel like still, because of their tradition of non-alignment, that they really can't count on anybody in a crisis. And so they are always measuring the bilateral relationship with China with reference to, say, where US-China relations are. And so, I mean, there has been a bit of a rapprochement in recent days after, say, the standoff on the border 2 years ago, a year ago. Let's see, I think it's one of the most interesting. The US-India relationship, the India-China relationship, and the India-Japan relationship, I think will determine broadly the nature of Indo-Pacific order in the 21st century.
Derek, you have anything to add? Let's go to Mr. Akimoto before I jump on this side of the room.
Satohiro Akimoto with Washington Insight. Program announcement said impact on Indo-Pacific. I'm not sure if it's whether it's on Indo-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific strategy, but what's the one big impact of this election on Indo-Pacific strategy in your mind? Just one. Thank you.
Yes. Anybody?
It's going to be hard to really predict on whether, first of all, whether Congress can have an impact on Indo-Pacific strategy, and particularly Congress that is going to be very much focused domestically in an election season. I think the one issue, I mean, if you look at the big issues of the Indo-Pacific, you look at the rise of China, the emergence of China, you look at North Korea, you look at South China Sea, which is part of the China portfolio, maybe perhaps India, and bringing India into that mix. Those are the big issues, and really it's China and North Korea are the two. But the impact, I was going to say, with North Korea, I think there's probably a relief that we're not going to go to war. As bad as the situation is with a nuclear North Korea, and Japan is very concerned, we're going to declare success and deal with the nuclear North Korea on its terms, on its own terms. But China, I think, is the one where we'll just have to see. That's the big kahuna, and whether the election will create dynamics where a China strategy or unified China approach overcomes, I think, the rest of these divisions to be a bipartisan issue, because it does get to jobs, it does do, workers at home, corporations abroad, our values everywhere, as well as a geopolitical position.
Although the concept of Indo-Pacific or whatever they call was proposed by Mr. Abe, I do not know what it means. Okay, basically. But one thing is for sure, because from the military point of view, the PACOM, the Pacific Command, has been Indo-Pacific all the time, since the birth. So they cover most of the Indian Ocean from the beginning. So from the military point of view, it has been Indo-Pacific forever and will be forever. The real question is, when we change the concept of that, probably we are inviting India to join us. But I failed to tell you, but I couldn't tell you, India is India. It's an independent subcontinental nation. And they won't be a maritime nation like we are. So we are inviting India by changing the name, but India will keep some healthy distance from that, because you have your own agenda in your subcontinent.
Dan, do you have anything to add? Gentleman up here in front in the center, and then I'll go over to this side. So I'm going to go like this.
Thank you. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist, and I know Derek well from having written about the Obama opening to Burma. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
My question builds off what all of you have been saying, which is that the Obama administration's pivot to Asia was sort of replaced by the Trump administration's great power rivalry competition. One of the consequences of the Obama policy was to act as sort of a brake on Chinese expansion in Southeast Asia, in the region. One of the great powers in the Trump administration's great power rivalry is China. So my question is, has this switch actually had an impact, either positive or negative, on putting a brake on Chinese expansion in the region? Thanks.
I'm happy for Derek to answer this, but can I just say I'm very impressed that you think the Obama administration stopped Chinese expansion.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that's not what I said.
Okay.
That's not what I said. I said that was one of the.
That was one of the aims.
One of the aims.
Because what I remember is the sort of the most aggressive militarization and expansionism China has shown since the war with Vietnam was during that period from 2012 to 16 when it militarized the South China Sea.
As I'm not an Obama administration official, I don't feel the need to defend it. I'll leave that to Derek.
Good. Over to you.
Which in my current incarnation, I'm not here to get that way.
Or maybe Cooney can.
Yeah, and maybe the greatest expansion of North Korea's nuclear capability happened during the 2000s. Anyway, so look, on this issue, there is some continuity here. I mean, I think your definition of the pivot or the rebalance is not entirely accurate. There's also a pivot within Asia, from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. And that was, in some way, China certainly took the rebalance as being about it and being about probably containing or circling it or somehow moving from Middle East meant that we were going to put more resources into Asia, and it was all about China. So, but I agree with you. I think the Trump folks took that a further step, thinking Obama was too much into engagement, giving too much, seeing that we had to find partnerships on issues like climate change or the Middle East or other things, or North Korea, and that overcame any concern about what China was becoming and what it was doing. So in that way, I do think it was in the way of course correction of a kind. But it wasn't as if the Obama folks weren't alert to the rise of China and the challenges of it. They just chose to look at it and deal with it a different way. I'm not sure I'm getting to your, is that getting to your question?
No, but it's interesting anyway.
Okay. And I may have lost track, but just defining this a little differently. But your question then is?
Well, my question was, if one of the effects or intended effects of the pivot was to put a brake on Chinese soft power influence in say Southeast Asia, has the switch to...
The switch done that?
Has the switch sped it, slowed it, or had no effect on it?
Yeah. I think this is the type of thing that's going to take some time. I don't know. Soft power is also not is a very, imprecise term, oftentimes used. I think China, because, and you can make the case, I'll make the case too, that China being overconfident, maybe about some of the things happening in 2009, maybe some of the engagement that and the signals early on in the Obama administration, got a bit overconfident and maybe showed their face too soon. Xi Jinping is showing claws too clearly, the power politics, too soon, and the world is pushing back. So it's not as if the United States is doing this. It's China itself doesn't really, they think they represent something that the world may desire. Maybe they feel their power will be irrepressible or irresistible. Maybe they feel that their money is irresistible and they can buy countries, and that they think these countries are bought through their aid or through their assistance, through their influence operations. I think folks are seeing China for what it is. The mask is off in some ways. I think many in China are unhappy with Xi Jinping for pulling the mask off too soon. Deng Xiaoping said keep the mask on for a while longer because we need to be stronger. It's not that China changed, it's that they're revealing themselves sooner. And I think that's having the effect much more than American policy is. I think we have to be careful, though, that we can get in the way of that if we get too hysterical, we get too much anti-China. If we make it about the United States and China, that's exactly what China wants. They don't want to make it about them, they want to make it about us and them in great power competition. And if it is that, I think they have the advantage rather than China versus the world, and what the world and these individual countries want to see, rather than the United States, trying to keep them down, which is what they want to serve.
As a hermit of Asia, I see some kind of continuity from the Obama administration to the current administration. So the question is, has rebalance really happened? And my answer is very simple. It's relative. And it's always conditional on the situation in the Middle East. Because if something happens in the Middle East, you cannot do that. You have to concentrate your resources on to whatever contingency in the Middle East. And while you cannot do a lot in East Asia, this is the reality of the U.S. forces at this moment. So even if we want to rebalance, it may not happen because anything could happen in the Middle East in the future.
Dan,
in the spirit of bipartisanship, I would like to say I think one of the great legacies of Barack Obama was during his transition handover meeting with Donald Trump, saying you have got to tackle the North Korea thing. Multiple administrations have not, and the Trump administration, we may disagree with some of the tactics, but arguably this is an administration that is more focused on that problem than any administration since Keto in the 1990s, possibly.
I think I'm going to go. Gentleman over here on the left, on my right, and then I'll come back.
I'm Hayato Tanaka from Japan Bank for International Cooperation. My question is on China. Going back to the question on what the U.S. Wants from China at the end of the day, do you see any difference between the two parties, Republican and Democrat, or would it be a more bipartisan consensus looking forward?
I think there's generally a consensus. In the specifics, there may be differences. The tactics may be differences. But the consensus and, fairness, equity, transparency,
Reciprocity.
Reciprocity, that's the word I was looking for. Reciprocity. All of that, I think we all want to see. I think the world would like to see the same thing. So I don't, but this stuff, we had in the Cold War, and I'm not saying this is a Cold War at all, but even in the Cold War, there was bipartisan consensus in the macro, but we had very much differences in how we thought about addressing the challenge. So again, I'm not saying what we're in is a Cold War with China. I'm just saying there may be a bipartisan consensus that China needs to be addressed in some basic principles. But in the how is where the differences may arise.
Dan?
You don't want a regime change? No.
Well, we'd like to see, like the people to have some justice in the country, I
I'm not
suppose.
suppo-
But no,
I'm
we're
not
not.
proposing.
No, I think people have different views on that. But no, we're not seeking regime change as a policy, as far as I know. But I'm not in the administration.
Can I just say I think there are two wild cards. One, are we entering a new Cold War, or actually are we just setting up to do a great trade deal? And I don't know what the answer is, right? I mean, markets jumped at the end of this week because they suddenly thought we were going to have a big U.S.-China deal. That's one wild card. Is this a structural competition, like a generational competition, or is this just a setup for us to shake hands? And then North Korea is the other wild card, right? Because there's a scenario where that brings America and China together. There's a scenario where that really pits us, depending on how you gauge China's interest in a settlement.
Gentlemen, right in front in the middle.
Thank you. Brian Chung from the Asia Group. I'm interested to know your views on how U.S. foreign policy towards Vietnam and Thailand is going to evolve over the next 1 year, not limited just only to the midterm election results effects. And I ask this against a backdrop of Vietnam's law on cybersecurity, where they just released a draft degree today, and it's very much based on the Chinese model of trying to control the internet. In Thailand, there's a really interesting phenomenon as well, where the military junta is trying to hold on to power after the elections that might be held or might not be held in February. And then Thailand is going to be the chair of ASEAN, and presumably is supposed to be one of the partners which the US will be trying to work with most to push back against China in Southeast Asia. Yet at the same time, they may be very, very divided after the election. So I would love to hear more about your thoughts about how U.S. foreign policy towards that will evolve.
Okay.
Well, on Vietnam, this is again a challenge with China. That they are developing tools and developing norms and standards that they can export, and they will, to autocrats everywhere. They're building a surveillance state inside Xinjiang or elsewhere in their country. And then they say, we have a model for you. And so what happens inside China does have external effects, and Vietnam is one example of where China model is being exported. It's interesting, yesterday, I think Freedom House came out with a report about digital, the internet freedom. And China, for the 4th consecutive year, got the lowest rating. Internet authoritarianism, they call it. And this is critical. And we have to grapple with this ourselves, because we have problems with social media and the lines where acceptable speech and unacceptable speech are. But that's where we have to go out and try and set standards and norms to push back against China, which clearly has its own standards and norms, which are not ours. So, I mean, Vietnam is I think we have other interests with Vietnam that are overriding some of these human rights issues. But we continue to have a dialogue with them that I think is bipartisan and support. To try to work with them on these questions of difference, even as we partner on some other issues. On Thailand, we'll see. It could be a new moment in Thailand. We don't know. But the way the Constitution is organized, the way the military has structured things, they pretty much have control regardless. I don't see there being that much change or that much attention, certainly in the United States, unfortunately, on that issue. We will, as institutes, but generally I don't see it being a major issue for certainly a partisan issue of any kind.
So in Thailand, I watched this rap video that has gone viral and now has 22 million views. And it looks to me like young Thais, at least the young Thais in this video, and all the young Thais who have watched that video, do want something different from their government than what they are getting. And so I don't see how you sustain this given demographic dynamics. That's one. On Vietnam, Vietnam has not had one-man rule since Ho Chi Minh. And I think we're all rather concerned at the move back to one-man rule, right? And the fact that Vietnam's extraordinary reform story since the end of one-man rule has legitimized the party in power. But that extraordinary reform story was tied to some degree of separation of powers at the top, at least some group decision-making that looks like it's falling away. And again, I think young Vietnamese want something very different than that. Young Vietnamese want to be able to use social media without going to prison. So I would keep an eye on this situation. And finally, we know Vietnam is perhaps more anxious about Chinese assertiveness and power than any other country for obvious historical and geographic reasons. My first trip to Vietnam, people said, the Chinese, you think you know the Chinese? They occupied us for 1,000 years. We know them best. We never want that to happen again. But the nature of the Vietnamese system is always going to limit its alliance opportunities with friendly democracies who have different systems.
And I'd just say very quickly something that we both focus on. The youth question globally is a huge one. The youth bulge in Africa, the youth in Middle East, youth in Vietnam, Thailand. That's where the hope comes. They have, also they're networked, and it could be for good or ill, but that's where I think the hope comes for pushing back against the tide, the current tide we're seeing on democracy and otherwise.
Let's go to the, if there's anyone on the side. I'll come back to the center to Gail.
We should have a woman. I'm very alert, by the way, that we are a manel. Maybe that's a Democratic thing to say. We're all guys out here.
It's not.
Well, I'm told that it is if we don't have somebody who's actually on the panel. Yeah.
No,
so hopefully
I don't
women
think
also
so.
ask questions. I know one in the back.
Gil Rosman, the Asan Forum. I wonder if we couldn't focus a little on whether the U.S. and Japan are going to be working together in thinking about China in the coming period, with an emphasis on Yachi Shotaro and how important he has been in shaping Japan's strategic thinking on one issue after another, and John Bolton, who's now the increasingly significant figure in shaping U.S. foreign policy on a whole host of issues. Do the Japanese trust Bolton? Are Yachi and Bolton likely to have good conversations? Is there a sense that Bolton will work well with the Japanese leadership, or just try to push Japan in a particular direction?
And since we're kind of coming up short in time, let me get to the lady in the back, and then come back to you, and then
That's your question.
move to the other side of the room. The one with the glasses, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Renata Janney with TV Asahi. I wanted to ask more of a question about the impact congressionally speaking. So I've kind of heard two different narratives. One, that if the Democrats do take the House, that they will do a lot more obstruction, even on foreign affairs, try to have more hearings, try to slow things down. But I've also heard Pelosi did an interview this week where she was talking more about cooperation, finding areas of cooperating, wanting to look like they weren't just the party of resistance that Trump's trying to paint them out to be. So generally, do you think that if there is a Democratic House, will we see more obstruction, or will we see more cooperation on foreign policy? Thank you.
I said at the beginning I do not talk about Japan today. But having said that, it will not answer your question. Mr. Yachi is a great person, but what is more important is the establishment of the creation of the National Security Council in my country. And in my country means Japan. And
Not somewhere in Desert Asia.
that really changed the policy-making process. So, but having said that, I think Mr. Abe is running the show, period. It's not Yachi, it's not anybody else. Mr. Abe is running the show. And by the same token, probably, Mr. Bolton, I do not know him, but I heard about his reputation, but I think he is implementing what Mr. Trump wants to do. So it's both Japan and the United States, the leaders, are taking the lead. And those advisors follow through. That's my answer.
And on the congressional issues,
Yeah.
Derek, I think
Well,
that might be.
Yeah, as a Democrat and as an American, what I want to see, I really hope, is that if Democrats get control of the House and the majority, they bring Congress back to what it should be. I'm sorry, which is not obstruction, which is oversight. Strong congressional balance of power or separation of power oversight. Asking the hard questions, working with the administration on things we agree with, asking them, that's what I really hope. And I think they probably will. I don't know that I'm trying to think of issues that are so divisive on the foreign policy realm that they'd want to be obstructive. Now, this administration often deals with opposition as hostility, as the enemy. So it takes two to tango on this. The Hill may decide they want not to be obstructive. They simply want to be, affirm their prerogatives as the Hill and as the majority in the House, and they want answers, and they'll push hard back. It's up to the administration to take it in that spirit and work with them. But I do expect Democrats not to do that. Certainly on foreign policy, on domestic policy, which I'm not really just an American observer of. There'll be I expect a lot of hearings, a lot of focus on health care and education, and making sure that the heat is on these guys and the focus is on the hot button issues that work for 2020 and that have not been asked, just as a matter of course, of Trump, regardless of politics, where the Hill finally does its job to hold his feet to the fire and provide appropriate oversight.
Hi there, my name is Hani Nasser from the Embassy of Canada. If I can just shift the conversation a little west, do you think that there might be an impact on the administration's South Asia policy? This was very much a push from the center, resources devoted to staying in Afghanistan. Going forward, if we have a Democratic House, and you guys touched a little bit on defense spending, how do you see that policy shifting, if at all? Thank you.
And then let me get to that lady in the back end. Thank you.
Jennifer Zhang from the Epoch Times. I heard one of our panelists raised a very interesting question of what do we actually want from China? Just some reduction of deficit or the change of regime or get rid of the party or some policy change. I do like to hear your answers, the panelists' answers to those questions. Thank you.
So with that, two.
Could I start on South Asia? I think the answer actually, there's pretty bipartisan consensus on a hardening of position on Pakistan, in particular on the Hill, which we have seen over the last 5 or so years, around the Pakistani security services activities in Afghanistan, around the Pakistani military's role in Pakistani political life, a lot more skepticism about various forms of assistance to Pakistan. And layered onto that now is a lot of bipartisan skepticism about bailing out the government of Pakistan for falling into various debt traps through Chinese infrastructure projects as part of the China-Pak economic corridor. So when you layer the China thing onto the kind of the terrorism charge in Afghanistan and the meddling in Pakistani democratic politics by the Pakistani armed forces, I think there is much more skepticism towards Pakistan today on Capitol Hill than there has been at any time, maybe since 9/11. That's Pakistan. On India, I think there's bipartisan consensus to move that relationship forward. On Afghanistan, it almost looks like the posture may be a very unsatisfactory mix that looks a lot like what it does today in terms of kind of special forces and advisors and enablers combined with still quite high degrees of assistance. There are some opportunities in South Asia, in the Maldives, which is a positive opportunity, and in Sri Lanka, where it looks like the wheels may be coming off the bus there. And so I would watch that space on South Asia.
And your question on where, on the second question on the where do you think we want in terms of this end game with China?
Again, I'm not sure how to answer it more than I have, to be very honest. And again, I think if you want to ask about a specific issue, we can say, well, this is what we want from China. But writ large, generically, it is the reciprocity, it's fairness, it's transparency. It's not regime change. It's how do we work with them as a major power that takes responsibility for not just itself, but for its impact on the world. And again, it's what we want to see from China, and then we're going to deal with the fact of what China wants for itself and how it views itself, because it has a long history and has its own pride and its own self-image. And we're going to have to work with those two components, and that's essentially how we work with the rest of the world. How do we think about this in partnership with the rest of the world? It's not a U.S.-China thing. It's finding like-minded nations who see things like we do, who want the same standards and norms, who want their own sovereignty to be affirmed and not to be offended by major powers, external powers. We'd like to empower those voices in their own sovereignty. So it's not just about China itself, but about how we deal with others in relation to what China represents and what it's exporting.
Anything to add?
Oh,
Dan, do you have anything?
Definitely it's not the regime change, because China will not change, and China doesn't want to be changed anyway. So from the viewpoint of the neighbors of China, we want a stable, less threatening China as a good neighbor. And so we don't want to be blunt. It's easy. It's not too strong and not too weak. That's the kind of China we want.
One last question goes to that gentleman over there.
Thank you. I'm Chung from Vietnam Embassy. My question is that with expectation that the Democrats maybe will gain control of the House, do you think that there will be more pressures on the administration to have more dialogues with China on trade, to go ahead with the FTA negotiation with the remaining TPP members? Thank you.
With dialogue on trade with China?
On TPP,
you're saying?
And with TPP members.
And with TPP members, if the Democrats. Democrats traditionally are more skeptical of these trade deals, actually, or more aligned, as I mentioned earlier, with the Trump administration, at least, more skeptical. But again, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, we'll have to also look to see what the profile of the Democrats coming in is. Again, there are lots of internationalist Democrats, moderate Democrats who've been veterans, who have foreign policy experience, who may have a different perspective on that. But I don't see Congress pushing on that. This is something that would have to happen, I think, after a 2020 election and a new government. And then, I don't know, maybe Trump at some point himself will see a value, but I don't see that. I think he's looking bilaterally with the different components of TPP, and maybe that's another way of getting, moving TPP forward and America's involvement in TPP without actually signing the new version of TPP. I mean, look, the NAFTA agreement, people say, I haven't read the details, it's very much reflective of what TPP is looking for. So if the Trump administration is fine with that, and those standards, and people on the Hill are generally okay with that, then maybe there could be a new look. But I'm not sure in election season that is a sellable proposition. The TPP label, for whatever reason, has become so toxic. And it was very strange for me as a Democrat and someone who cared a lot about TPP to see signs of the Democratic Convention, no TPP. I mean, why is that? It sort of became a symbol of something so much bigger that I'm not sure everybody really understood what it meant, but it definitely was associated with loss of jobs, of vulnerability in the heartland, of just this sensibility that the elites are making deals that are not working for them. They're not considered. So I think that kind of healing has to happen in the United States before we can move. Certainly the Democrats can take that step, or even Washington can take the step of moving forward on some of these deals that have that kind of burden on it.
Great, gentlemen.
Can I say 10 seconds?
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of talk about trade.
Well,
I actually think
like.
we need to talk about supply chains. And I do think what the administration with significant congressional support wants to do is decouple China's role from American supply chains, particularly in dual use and high technology, right? I think we talk about trade as if like things are made in one country and then they're put on a ship and sent to another country. Most global trade doesn't work that way anymore, right? And so it's worth a conversation about supply chains and about technology controls, actually of the kind we had during the Cold War. But then you think about it, and you think where technology is and where it's going. And then you say, well, how on earth is the US government going to regulate that? And that's a whole separate conversation.
That is another good topic for another event, actually. But with that, thank you so much, all of you. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. If you can join me in thanking this wonderful panelist. Don't forget this man. Thank you for coming. Oh, thank you. This was fun, as always.
Anyway, I may get in touch with you. Yours was about